The BenQ Mobiuz EX2510S goes up to 165Hz, which is a slight improvement over its predecessor, which goes up to 144Hz. Now in this review, I'm going to be seeing if it's actually worth its price tag, because in the UK it can be found for £230, which is up from £200, and in the US it can be found for $300, which is up from roughly $250. So jumping straight into the deep end, let's talk about its gaming performance. And here indeed the monitor goes up to 165Hz. However, I'll be hard pressed if you can find a difference between 144 and 165Hz, let alone 180Hz or maybe above. Now, I will say that for someone who's reviewed over 190 monitors and has over 2,000 hours in competitive Counter-Strike, I can safely say that there's no real difference in terms of perceivable difference between the two refresh rate monitors. Now, nevertheless, in terms of the response time of the monitor, it's actually really impressive. Here I was able to dial up the AMA, in other words the overdrive, into its maximum setting, that's level 3, and incur very little inverse ghosting. At least on a game like Counter-Strike, which looks like a bit of a potato, there is very little amount of ghosting that occurs. However, if you were to go on a game like Destiny 2, or let's say if you're going to be scrolling through text on, let's say, your web page, then you might notice a little bit of inverse ghosting, and as a result you might want to dial down that AMA to level 2 or level 1, or even completely disable it if you don't need it. Now moving on, we get onto input lag, and here I found that the BenQ very much performed like its predecessor, whereby the input lag isn't as impressive as the likes of the AOC 24G2U, which still to this day, in my opinion, is the best 144Hz IPS gaming monitor out there on the market. Now as a result, there is a slight input delay, so if you're a hardcore gamer, then you might want to look at the AOC alternative instead. However, if you're not going to be playing at top echelon of Counter-Strike, or for example, you don't play hardcore competitive games but you want a decent all-round monitor, then the BenQ will definitely suffice. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say over here is that you should just consider that the input lag of the AOC, in my opinion, was better than the BenQ. Now I should also mention the monitor comes with a blur reduction tool where you can enable it via the OSD, and I'll showcase this further down in this review. Ultimately, it is useful for those people who do experience a bit of blur or just want to reduce that motion blur. So for example, if you're playing like sim racing or something like that, then it will be quite useful. In a game like Counter-Strike, I didn't find it too useful, but of course you might like to enable it, and the option is there for you to use. Elsewhere, the monitor has AMD FreeSync technology built in. Now in my case, I don't have an AMD graphics card, but running on my RTX 2080 Super connected over DisplayPort, I was able to run the NVIDIA Pendulum demo without any issues or hiccups. So of course your mileage may vary depending on terms of your setup, but at least in my case I was able to run G-Sync. Now next up we get onto HDR, and here the monitor does have an HDR10 capability. So if you're on console it might be quite useful, but if you're on PC you'll find it's limited to around 400 nits, at which point the monitor's HDR capabilities don't really shine through. While they are there and they're supported, if you're playing on PC you might want to just even play on SDR. Although there is a slight catch. When you're running on SDR, you're limited to around 250 nits of peak brightness, where on HDR you go up to 400 nits. So if you do want to get the most in terms of brightness out of the monitor, then HDR gaming or its HDR input will allow you to reach that higher amount of brightness. Speaking of which, this perfectly leads me on to its brightness. Now here, as you'll be able to see on your screen, the monitor's brightness levels does depend in terms of what mode you're running on. Specifically on blur reduction mode, it will really much reduce the overall peak brightness, specifically in terms of minimum brightness. But the thing I want to highlight over here is that these measurements were done on its SDR mode, and as such it's quite a shame not to see it reaching 400 nits. That's what you can achieve if you run on HDR. It would have been great to see if BenQ had integrated the HDR brightness in terms of its SDR mode as well. So for example, if I'm playing Counter-Strike and therefore non-HDR gaming, I could have achieved 400 nits, or let's say at least 300 nits or 350 nits, because it would have just made the gaming experience all that little bit better. Now, is 250 nits enough for you in terms of SDR gaming? I think it will just about suffice if you're in a bright room, although some people might find it a little bit too dull. In my case, I was just wishing that it was just a little bit more, and as a result it's a slight little weakness of the monitor. Now as for brightness uniformity, it's pretty decent for a monitor of its class. I had no inherent issues, and as for backlight speed, as we're able to see on your screen right now, I had no real issues on my panel, but of course this is quite panel lottery, so it really depends in terms of how your monitor performs versus the one I have. So next up we get onto color accuracy, utility. Now the monitor has a dedicated sRGB mode through the OSD, and when enabled I was outstanding at the results. I achieved 96.5% in the gamut coverage and 98.2% in gamut volume. You'll be able to see over here it's slightly overzealous in terms of the warmer tones and does a little bit worse in terms of the pinkish reddish tones. Now as for its color accuracy, in comparison to the sRGB standard, it has an average delta of 0.84 and a maximum of 3.72 with a contrast ratio at 1055:1, which frankly is absolutely outstanding for a monitor of its price and indeed of its class. Indeed, this monitor very much competes with the likes of the AOC24 GTU, and it's also great to see that this monitor doesn't have a capped brightness, at least in terms of sRGB brightness levels in comparison to non-sRGB SDR levels. In other words, you can achieve around 250 nits in sRGB or non-sRGB mode, and that's just pretty good because you could pretty much run this monitor in sRGB mode pretty much predominantly or all the time and even still benefit from using AMA, which sometimes is locked in certain sRGB modes on certain monitors. Ultimately, what I'm trying to convey over here is that the monitor can be used for picture editing or video grading. So for those people who are gamers and also like myself and edit pictures or videos, then this monitor can very much be used for that utility. Now moving on to the OSD, which can be accessed through a set of physical buttons found behind the monitor, you'll be able to see over here you can select the different inputs, and through the different inputs you can select the different modes, so standard, game or cinema. I do find scenario mode slightly odd, and it's something that I've previously mentioned in my BenQ reviews. Now as for quick menu, it's quite useful for you to quickly adjust settings at a single touch of a button, so this is good that you can adjust it per different modes. And as for the color mode, here's what I was referring to in terms of the sRGB mode, that certain menus are actually blacked out. Most of them, most people want to actually use apart from AMA, so it's nice to see that AMA is actually able to still be used in sRGB mode. If you do want full access to it, you can go through the different other modes, such as the custom mode, which gives you all the controls that you might want, including RGB values that can be adjusted in terms of color temperature. Now as for eye care, it's got a sensor found at the front of the monitor with BI+, so you can enable that if you want, and you've also got low blue light mode as well. Now as for audio, I've actually been very impressed with the overall audio quality that BenQ has produced as of late, and the EX2510S is no different. In its cinema EQ, I found it to be quite impressive throughout the frequency range. Although it's not going to compete with a set of bookshelf speakers or let's say headphones or anything, it is a nice addition. And in terms of volume, it does get to a certain level of volume, but it's not exactly going to fill a full room full of sound. Now as for system, you have got different settings, but the most important one will be potentially to look at the information to see what refresh rate and resolution you're running on. And finally we get onto the build quality and design, and here the monitor has a three-sided borderless design and a slightly thicker bezel at the bottom, but it's not too distracting. There's a handy little HDR toggle as well found at the front bottom right of the monitor. Now as for the stand, it has height, tilt and pivot adjustment, however the monitor cannot be rotated, so something to be mindful of. Now what I do find quite strange, and it's similar sort of comments that I've made in the past about BenQ monitor stand, is the fact that the manufacturers integrated quite a neon orange coloured silicon material which sits at the front. Now this might not concern some people out there, but I've seen others complaining about different coloured themes that some monitor manufacturers use, and here I think some people will not appreciate the bright orange colour that BenQ has chosen. And so this all brings me on to my verdict. Would I recommend this monitor? Well, frankly, over its predecessor, I don't really see much of a point. The 165 versus 144 Hz is so minimal that most people won't even notice it, let alone for seasoned veterans like myself. Then if you consider the fact that it's also a little bit more pricey, and in terms of its input lag not being as impressive as the likes of the AOC24 GTU, it begs the question, why would you get the S model versus the non-S model? I would say the regular EX2510 or the 2710 is a great alternative for people who want to have HDR capabilities. So for example, if you're a console and PC gamer. If however you don't care about HDR like myself and you're more of a hardcore competitive gamer, then you should get the AOC24 GTU instead, because it pretty much performs better in most domains in comparison to the BenQ. So that's just my thoughts and opinions about the monitor. I'd be intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. And of course, if you like this detailed review, drop a like, subscribe to see more from the channel, and hit that bell notification, as it'd all be very appreciated. Alright, I've been Totally Dubbed, take care of yourselves, and goodbye.